Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first unscripted video on this channel. Today, I will be covering the concept of absolute knowing as it's understood by Slavoj Žižek. I based most of my notes here on what Žižek wrote in Less Than Nothing, his 2012 magnum opus. Now, if you have any topics you would like me to cover in these sorts of unscripted videos, be sure just to leave them in the comment section and I will try my best to cover them. So in order to understand what absolute knowing is, you first need to understand what the absolute itself is. And according to Žižek, the absolute is the subject. And that's because the subject is absolute in the sense that it can never step outside of itself and experience true otherness. The subject is always trapped within its transcendental horizon. So, for example, you can never have knowledge or experience an object as it is in itself. That's just an incoherent idea. That object always already appears to you from within your transcendental horizon, within the self-relation that constitutes subjectivity. And that's essentially what it means for the subject to be absolute. It is stuck within its transcendental horizon. And this is why Žižek has such a big issue with the interpretations of Hegel that emphasize recognition above all else. While recognition does play a role in Hegel's phenomenology, it's by no means the central aspect of it. And that's because, according to Žižek, Hegel's ultimate belief in terms of recognition is that recognition is fundamentally impossible because we always fail to truly recognize otherness. We can never truly grasp otherness fundamentally because the subject is absolute. It's caught within its own self-relation that it simply can't escape, because that's what it means to be a subject. To be a subject is to be that self-relation. So I'd like to quote this passage from Žižek's book, The Incontinence of the Void, where he talks about what it means for the subject to be absolute. So I quote, "This is why our thesis is that of a contingent absolute. Once the subject emerges, it is absolute, the point of reference of its world from which it is not possible to abstract, although its emergence is thoroughly contingent. Absolute does not mean omnipotent, all-knowing, or anything similar. Absolute describes an entity whose relation to other entities is always mediated by itself relating. What this means is that absolute can be said to designate the subject's self-limitation, its inability to step outside its own horizon," unquote. So just as I was saying before, what it means for the subject to be absolute, according to Žižek, is for it to be unable to step outside its transcendental horizon. And Žižek also talks about, especially in his book, Hegel in a Wired Brain, which we covered on this channel, is that the subject is always outside of reality in a certain sense. What it means to be a subject is to be able to alienate yourself from reality. You escape the natural immediacy of non-self-conscious objects, and that's what it means to be a subject. And because you're always stepping outside of reality to look upon it as an object, the subject is, as Žižek would say, the consciousness is unconscious, because by stepping out of reality, you can't then look upon yourself as you are, because you are the source of that looking. So this essentially means that the subject cannot know anything other than itself, but it also can't truly know itself, because to see itself as it truly were, like, let's just say the subject is here. To see itself as it truly were, it would have to be out here looking upon it. But this is what the subject is. So the subject can never escape itself So that's the paradox of the subject. The subject can never truly escape itself, but it also can't know itself for what it truly is. The subject is just its experience, and this experience is limitless in the sense that it can never access its limitations precisely because it's bound by its limitations. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that the subject is infinite in its very finitude, or it's finite in its very infinitude, or experience of itself as infinite. It can't, one definition of infinity is not having limits. And while the subject does have limits in its experience of itself, it can't access those limits because that would mean it's outside of those limits. So essentially, that's what it means for the subject to be absolute. So now that we've established what the absolute is, what is absolute knowing? Well, we first have to get rid of the caricature of absolute knowing as some sort of monstrous devouring force that brings all of reality into itself and knows everything about reality. I don't think that's what it means for Hegel, and it's certainly not what it means for Žižek. Rather, for Žižek, he emphasizes that the absolute is more of a perspectival shift in the way you see yourself and the way you see reality. So as we're just discussing, the subject is always absolute, and it is always trapped within its limits, its transcendental horizon. Now, according to Žižek, absolute knowing is simply recognizing this limit, simply recognizing the fact that we as subjects can never escape our transcendental horizon. And in this sense, the dialectical movement of consciousness, as it tries to attain knowledge of the object, it ends there because you've met the hard limit. You've met the limit of the dialectical movement because you've essentially recognized that, well, we can never attain the object, and that is absolute knowing, because the absolute is the fact that we can never attain the object. So knowing this is absolute knowing. Now, just to quote a passage from Žižek's Less Than Nothing, which kind of gives an overview of his understanding of absolute knowing, quote, "And is not what Hegel calls absolute knowing the endpoint of these reversals? When the subject stumbles upon the final limitation, the limitation as such, which can no longer be inverted into a productive self-assertion, absolute knowing thus does not mean knowing everything, it rather means recognizing one's limitations. Absolute knowing is the final recognition of a limitation which is absolute in the sense that it is not determinate or particular, not a relative limit or obstacle to our knowledge that we can clearly see and locate as such. It is invisible as such because it is the limitation of the entire field as such, that closure of the field which, from within the field itself, cannot but appear as its opposite, as the very openness of the field. Absolute knowing is a name for the acceptance of the absolute limitation of the circle of our subjectivity, of the impossibility of stepping outside of it." So once you understand absolute knowing in these terms, it doesn't seem all that complex. It's not that difficult of an idea to grasp. The subject always is absolute because it cannot step outside of its transcendental horizon and grasp the object as it is in itself. And absolute knowing is simply the recognition of this limitation, which ends the dialectical movement of consciousness, which attempts to grasp the object. In the end, this entire movement ends in failure, but a failure that internalizes its own limitation, its own failure, and thus attains a perspectival shift, which Žižek calls absolute knowing. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. Please consider becoming a patron if you would like to have access to some extra material and other benefits. Please consider joining our philosophy and theology Discord as well. That's all I've got for today. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. God bless you all.